We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Archaeoanimals, the podcast all about zooarchaeology. As always, I'm your host, Alice Fitzpatrick, and with me,
Simona Falanga.
Today is actually kind of the start of a mini-series, which we haven't really done. I mean, we've kind of accidentally done it by, mostly doing video game episodes for like the last couple months.
Pretty much. I think that we're trying to remedy that with putting some research back into the mix. Because I think it just came to me just randomly one afternoon, be like, oh, but what about like do a little mini-series and we cover various time periods like in each episode.
Yeah. So
here we are. I mean, one thing about it is that it might be very Britain-centric. We do apologise, but we do, spoiler, have another mini-series planned that will hopefully remedy that. So stay tuned for that.
In a few months' time. Yeah, so we are doing what we're calling Time Warped. Or at least that's the very good title I came up with, because I'm very good at making up titles. And it will be a mini-series where every episode we will be going to different time periods and kind of covering, in general, what zooarchaeology was like for that time period, if that makes sense. Which I guess is an oversimplification, but you know us. We'll always have our case studies, and it'll just be a really interesting way to kind of look at how the zooarchaeological record changes over time. And today's episode, it will be over a massive period of time.
Well, that's the thing. I think the entire mini-series, or especially sort of earlier on, will be a bit of an oversimplification because we're dealing with such like large chunks of time, which of course, they'll get smaller over time. But it's very difficult to then condense all that information in an hour. And especially in today's episode, I mean, we will cover the earlier prehistoric period. It's a big chunk of time because it goes all the way from the late Pleistocene to the early Bronze Age. So, of course, it will include the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, the Neolithic, and part of the Bronze Age. The way we're starting off in this book, a huge chunk of time. So we're going from sort of when the first Homo sapiens remains were found in Britain, sort of around 44,000 BP, to the end of the early Bronze Age, which is around 1000 BC. But again, that's in Britain. Of course, these dates will shift across various geographical regions. And as I said, you'll notice that, these periods will get shorter and shorter, so that we leave the realm of prehistory and then delve into history. And of course, this is partially because when the written record is present, it's much easier for archaeologists to mark substantial changes within a past population. So to make an example of something that's clearly very close to my heart, the Romans abandoning Britain, and then several Germanic groups taking their place. If you're playing bingo, there you go, Romans, there's that. I managed to shove it in there in early prehistory.
And we have a whole episode about the Roman period coming up, too. So, there's really no reason for us to shove the Romans in. And yet, here's Simona doing her due diligence.
And it's almost become principle now. They've got to shove them in there. Like, and for those who are not aware of the running joke, I'm actually not terribly fond of Roman archaeology. I just ended up knowing more about Roman archaeology for reasons beyond my ken.
It's your curse.
Of course, like it is going to be quite brief and perhaps oversimplified. I mean, just to give a very quick overview of the time periods we'll be dealing with, I guess we can divide it into two chunks. So you have anything going up until the Neolithic, the start of the Neolithic. We'll see humans living in hunter-gatherer societies primarily, likely moving camps between seasons. And then from the Neolithic, we see a shift to sedentary. Oh, I'm foreign. Leave me be.
I'm foreign too.
Agriculture, and so I'm not a native English speaker. Is that better?
That's true.
We see a shift for people who don't budge, and they will just stay put in a settlement, and they'll keep livestock. And then, of course, you start seeing domesticated species surfacing, several of which we indeed still see on our farms. While in the Bronze Age, we see a shift from using flint tools to those made of copper and its various alloys.
Yeah, and the one thing I find really interesting about this particular period, and I guess it's also kind of not accurate to call this a period, as it's more of a very expansive, piece of time itself, really. But it's really interesting to kind of look at zooarchaeologically, because you have all these changes in the flora and fauna of Britain. So kind of, in the early to mid-Holocene, you have changes in temperature after that last glaciation period. So you see, in England specifically, the kind of woodland areas replace the original grassland. So as these environments begin to change so dramatically, you end up seeing this pretty big shift in kind of species that are prevalent versus, species that were prevalent prior to that. So it is really interesting, but there's also the downside of these periods haven't necessarily been, at least in comparison to other periods of time in zooarchaeology, there isn't as much research, it seems like. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, because we'll probably get into this later as well, but of course, there would have been a lot less people around. So of course, the evidence will be a lot scarcer just in terms of sheer numbers. And also it's just something that it's not as easy to come across, especially in a country like Britain, where a lot of the archaeology is sort of developer-led.
Yes, of course.
It's not something that you easily come across through non-destructive methods. There's something that we do have some fairly big sort of research sites that are sort of early prehistoric in nature. Also, because, a lot of these sites will be, for instance, cave sites, which, of course, will not necessarily be a developer-led, unless someone wants to build a house on top of a cave, which maybe not.
One of the things that I actually find really interesting about this period we're covering, the early prehistoric period, is that there's so many changes. Again, we are talking about such a huge period of time. So there is that kind of time for all those changes. But because of the kind of environmental and climate change going on, you get these pretty big changes in the type of flora and fauna in Britain. So you have that last glaciation period, and right after that, you have these pretty significant changes in temperature. And what used to be this kind of grassland that covered Britain, especially northern England, gets kind of replaced by more open woodlands. So you get species that either get pushed in or pushed out of these regions over time. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting perspective for zooarchaeologists.
It really is, in a way, you can use the animal remains to almost map out these changes in climate. Of course, you'd have certain species that are particularly suited to one or the other climate. So, of course, if you see in sort of on your archaeological site a lot of sort of species that you'd associate with woodland, such as like wild boar and deer, like it might point to, you know, like a warmer climate and vice versa. So it's something, actually, for those who are interested, we did talk a little bit about this on our Pleistocene megafauna episode, I think a couple months back. Mm-hmm. So if you want to know more about it, please feel free to check it out. Lots of changes.
Yeah. So zooarchaeologically, you have these huge changes that you don't necessarily see in the later periods, because obviously you're not really seeing huge differences in, again, the environment and climate. Obviously, we have massive changes coming up because of human-induced activities. Obviously, once we get to talking about the Romans, or once Simona gets to talking about the Romans in a later episode in this mini-series, we're going to have lots to talk about, or to kind of re-talk about, because I feel like we've talked about this a lot in terms of introductions, Romans bringing over whatever they want, all the other fun stuff.
Now, who's mentioning the Romans all the time?
I'll just say, okay, I mean, it's a brand now. We have to mention the Romans. Otherwise, our many dozen of fans will be upset. But
yeah, because I guess like most of the changes will be sort of man-made for the most part in terms of deforestation and sort of introductions and extinctions. I mean, you do have some climatic changes, but I think comparatively that they're not as stark as we'd see sort of earlier on. But again, we have much smaller chunks of time to work with. I mean, like you do have talks, you know, of a mini ice age in the medieval period. And I think when the Romans occupied Britain, like it was slightly warmer. And then sort of like that warmer climate was replaced by, you know, a slightly like colder and wetter climate. But of course, not to the same extent of, you know, a glacial or interglacial. It's just comparatively, it's a very, very small fluctuation in climate. And of course, I guess now we're heading back towards a warmer stage again. But again, that's mostly man-made. So, well, there is a reason why there's talks of like, of sort of relabeling sort of these past like thousands of years as Anthropocene as opposed to Holocene. Because,
or Cthulhucene.
I mean, yeah. The way things are going, why not? Surely. Sure.
That's more of a post-humanist, I think, approach. But yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I think zooarchs in particular, I remember going to a conference a couple of years ago where that was like one of the main questions is, when does the Anthropocene start? Is it when, you know, chickens are getting domesticated? Is it there's like a whole other, like a whole list of things. And me being someone who works in the later prehistoric period, I was just like, I don't care.
But I guess, again, with that, it's difficult to sort of use to get, you know, a blanket date that would cover the entire planet, because there's very sort of stark differences geographically. So, of course, you know, if you're talking... And again, like I don't necessarily have any facts to support this. I mean, it's just a personal opinion. I mean, if you take Britain, maybe as an example, I would put it down sort of like the late Neolithic or the Bronze Age was sort of like the first mass deforestation happens. So that's sort of like one of the first times you see like a very big impact. Because, you know, you get domestication a little bit earlier on. So like, you know, in the Paleolithic and Mesolithic. And of course, you get humans you know, actively hunting wild species. But of course, you know, it was to such a smaller scale, so because there were so much fewer of us, that it wouldn't have had necessarily a massive impact. But then again, also there is also, you know, theories out there that a lot of the animals, sort of like the late Pleistocene animals, were hunted to extinction by humans. So could that be a date as well? Because like with humans potentially being one of the many factors behind one of the big extinction events. Even though, of course, that's another sort of kettle of fish in a way, because there's a lot of theories going around. Of course, humans were probably over-hunting these animals in some places, but there's a lot of climatic factors. It's just that the list is endless. Again, it's difficult to just pin it down to one thing.
Yeah, you can't really do it in a vacuum. There are many factors. And I think that's kind of going to be a running theme in this mini-series is, you know, all the period names, all of these, they are very arbitrary at the end of the day.
That's the thing, actually. It's a good way to follow up, because I think it's probably a disclaimer that's going to go on every single episode on the miniseries, because you'll hear us using these terms, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Of course, it is very arbitrary, because we're basically deciding, this chunk of time from exactly this year to exactly this year is the Iron Age, because they just, people just rocked up in 700 BC, if we're talking about Britain, saying, okay, no more of that copper stuff, iron. We do iron. We've just discovered this. Iron is brilliant. Everything is done in iron now. But, it is very arbitrary. Or, like in the Neolithic, you start seeing a shift of farming. Is, like the first year of the Neolithic period, everyone, all these species were being domesticated overnight. Let's farm the land. But these changes wouldn't have happened overnight. They wouldn't have happened in the same time frame in sort of the various geographical locations. It's much like when we're talking about domestication in a way. It's not like, cattle was domesticated in the Near East, just overnight, and aurochs just turn into a cattle in a field the following day. But in a way, like, it is useful to use these terms, because, of course, if I tell you this site dates back to the Mesolithic period, you know exactly which time range I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But it's just, just to stress several times over that, of course, it is very arbitrary, and we need to bear that in mind.
We don't want people to yell at us. This is our disclaimer. We'll keep saying it. And I mean, that's like also just kind of something in general with archaeology. A lot of not that the time periods are arbitrary, but, we're ballparking a lot of times with the time period, especially when we date things, much older things. So, it's a nice kind of way to compartmentalize the sort of similarities in this particular time period. But there's always a bit of a, disclaimer.
It's just for ease of discussion. Because again, as I say, Bronze Age, most people will know sort of what period we're talking about, because there would have been a lot of transition. So, of course, leading up to the Bronze Age, people were probably already using copper and its alloys. But I guess it's once it becomes very prevalent and widespread that, I guess, in times of yore, they went, okay, this is the Bronze Age.
I get it.
But while we muse on that, I think we'll take a break.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ANIMALS.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
And we are back with Archaeoanimals, and this is the first episode of a little mini-series we're calling Time Warped, where we're kind of just breaking down zooarchaeology by period. And right now, we're kind of doing a lot of periods at once as part of the early prehistoric.
Well, essentially, because as we discussed earlier, you'll see this period's getting smaller and smaller over time. But I guess usually the less we know about them, the larger the chunk of time is, seems to be the trend here.
Yeah, but we can kind of divide this big period of time into, two kind of smaller ones.
Because it's still quite large.
Oh, yeah. But, smaller than it was before.
Because, of course, in the early prehistoric, you get, of course, the Paleolithic, which is, I believe in the profession, is just called hunter-gatherer central. And then we have the Mesolithic, which is still hunter-gatherer central. And then you see the Neolithic, when, again, overnight, people just left their home and saw that an aurochs had turned into a cow in the middle of their field and went, ooh.
Yep.
Farming, yeah,
exactly
absolutely
what
happened. And I believe the early Bronze Age as well will be part of the early prehistoric period. So it's basically from, I think we were going by the first human remains discovered in Britain at least, so 44,000 years ago or thereabouts, up to the end of the early Bronze Age, which I believe is 1000 BC. It's a good 43,000.
Yeah, but again, if we break it up into these kind of two main chunks, it's not as bad, right?
Yes, I think we're probably going to divide them in a way that I guess we'll cover. So the Paleolithic up until the end of the Mesolithic, because, what both have in common is, mainly consisting of sort of hunter-gatherer societies. And then we can put together the Neolithic up to the end of the early Bronze Age for sort of, I guess, the farming phases, because that's in sort of these two chunks where we'll see most of the shift in species represented in the archaeological record. So we'll do that. And I'll put my phone on silent too.
Good job. Anyway, so looking at this first chunk, the Paleolithic to the end of the Mesolithic, kind of difficult to talk about, huh? Because we still don't know that much about it.
No, because I guess we don't have as much evidence of it. I mean, of course, the main one that encompasses the entire prehistoric period is if you don't have a written record, I mean, you can gain some inference from the evidence that you find, but of course the written record adds the extra, but why? So, that extra depth is not there, of course. But as we said, we don't have as much material evidence either, in terms of there's not as much work done sort of concerning these time periods in comparison to other periods. Of course, it is changing. But one of the main reasons that I can think of is that, of course, agricultural societies would leave what we call features dug into the soil horizon. So, they'll have, all the agricultural related thing. They'll have their drainage ditches and such. And these tend to be a lot easier to identify through non-destructive methods. So in a way, even if you're not going to dig it, there are ways in which you can survey. You can carry out a survey and think, oh, look, there is a later Iron Age settlement in this area. Because the
LiDAR
or just, magnetometry, there's several.
Don't understand them. Can't have nothing to add to it because it's like magic to me at this point.
So the archaeology wizards.
The archaeology wizards who do the geomag stuff, and then I just sit there going, I have no idea what that is. I don't understand anything you're showing me. That's why
archaeology in a way is so specialized. So even within the field of archaeology, you'd have people, that specialize in the most varied of things, going from, magnetometry survey to ceramic building material or metalworking slag.
Absolutely
exactly.
Different language.
There is a wizard for everything. But that which makes you, the animal bone wizard.
Yeah, that's us. The animal bone necromancers or something. I don't know.
Going back to sort of the archaeological features, again, it does make it easier to sort of pinpoint where the settlement or the archaeological activity is. Well, a lot of early prehistoric remains, especially pre-farming, will not be sort of stratified in the same way because they're not within sort of formal features. And the main example that comes to mind is sort of a flint scatter, where people sort of in the early prehistoric period would have worked a flint to make their tools of weaponry of, whatever they wanted to make with it. And, all the debris would be left sort of on the surface. They're not within a feature. They're not within a pier or anything. They're just scattered over the surface and then covered with soil over time. So in a way, finding sort of this type of archaeological activity is what I call almost like archaeology bingo, because you never quite know where they're going to pop up. And so you do still get settlements and camps, but again, there's not, because those will leave evidence in the ground. Because if you're setting a structure, of course you'll have your posts, your structural posts going in the ground. So usually the wood doesn't get preserved. We're way too damp a climate for that in Britain, at least. But you will get the post hole.
Yeah, we love post holes. We love post holes.
Can have a bonus episode, postals. But again, we won't find as many of them. Also because, again, a lot less people and a lot less settlements. So, again, in a country where a lot of the archaeology is developer-led, you're not necessarily going to find, this settlement in up on a hill on all these weird and wonderful places. But some do exist that have been sort of intensively studied. Of course, Carr being the major one, which we will cover in one of the case studies later on.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's difficult. Especially these early periods, it is very difficult to talk about because of these kind of gaps that, as you said, are partially just, we haven't really done as much research, but also partially it is just really difficult to find any of these things. I mean, what we do have and what other archaeologists have kind of developed in terms of interpretation is extremely impressive for how little we have materially. But we do
say, sorry, it must be quite daunting to sort of as interesting as it is, because of course you've got so little evidence to work by. So really, hats off for sort of all the early prehistorians that sort of, in spite of sort of the relative lack of evidence, do manage to produce some fantastic pieces of work and research. So
yeah, well, I mean, we'll talk about it in the case studies, but I had a brief brush with early prehistoric, and it is extremely stressful to take on. But what we do know is, we have kind of a general idea of what the prevalent crafted industries were, which is basically your hunting and your fishing. We're not necessarily seeing what we see as we enter the Neolithic, which is that shift into farming and kind of developing the industries that will branch out into what we see later on. And as such, you don't really, I feel like species-wise, we're obviously not seeing domesticates yet.
I mean, yes and no in a way, because I believe Mesolithic, I think we have, at least in Britain, is when we start seeing dogs, or what will eventually be dogs, if that makes sense. Because I think we have Paleolithic evidence of dogs elsewhere, just not in Britain.
Yeah, it's very, dogs is weird because this is obviously a period where we are in that kind of transition period with domesticates for dogs. They are, we're developing those relationships. Dogs are becoming what we obviously understand as dogs, and it's a weird period of time of kind of identifying what is a dog and what is not. What's the mid period kind of semi-feral dog, which I think is the case sometimes. And the only dog example that I was able to find that was definitely from Mesolithic Britain was the canine tooth found at Blickmead, which is a site near Stonehenge. And archaeologists have been using it to kind of look at diet and migration because there's just been a lack of human remains. And that makes sense, obviously, because of the relationship between a domesticated dog and a human. They would have kind of a similar diet, which is extremely smart move on them. But there doesn't seem to be as many dog remains in Mesolithic Britain.
And I guess it's also, I guess, where do you start calling them dogs? Because again, it doesn't just apply to dog. Again, it's back to the example of like Neolithic farmer leaves his house and finds like an aurochs has turned into a cow overnight. You know, like domestication of dogs, again, took place over sort of a vast geographical area, so in several geographical areas at different time periods, and you would have taken a very long time to go from your wolf to dog. Again, like sort of making reference to that internet joke of like, oh, I'll get close to these humans. What could possibly go wrong? And then bam, chihuahua.
Yeah, no, but it is very interesting. It is just very difficult. I mean, again, we'll talk about it in the case studies, but it's very hard to work in this time period and try to be kind of concrete about things, because the truth is it's a very weird kind of transition period for a lot of different things, you know?
Yeah, so I guess, of course, aside from domesticates, of course, you'll get your wild mammals, which are regularly hunted. And I should expect, you'll find several species of deer, aurochs, of course. You'll find variety of canids. Your sort of dogs / wolf dogs, but also, like just your standard wolf and foxes. You get lagomorphs. So, because in the case of Britain, it will just be hares, as rabbits are not going to be around for quite a few thousand years, but of course elsewhere, probably rabbits as well. Mustelids, so, like pine marten, which again has since gone extinct, but is coming back now.
Yeah.
And badgers. Which again, like badgers, I'm not sure whether they're necessarily eaten, because I don't think it's a very healthy thing to eat badger. But they would have probably, I guess, similar to other time periods, they would have been used for pelts and leather. Yeah. So that's common to several time periods, even like also up to the Saxon periods, you do find evidence of like badger being like, again, used for pelts. Then you do get a fair amount of fish.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just mentioned fish, and all I saw was like some paws reaching for me from below, because like bastard decided to stretch using sort of like my desk as a surface, and so these two paws sticking out, and it was a bit confusing.
Bastard, Simona's cat, just for any listeners who don't know the in-jokes. But I mean, yeah, you get your fish. This is something I think we specifically see as we move up north to, Scotland, the Northern Isles. They're utilizing marine sources for subsistence. You have your salmon, which I was actually surprised that salmon apparently being very prevalent in some Mesolithic sites in Britain. You have your marine resources, cod, save, haddock, pollock, and then those sea mammals, which were whales, which probably were more used if they were beached, and as well as seals and dolphins. Anything that was like washing up, understandably, was probably scavenged and eaten. And your birds, water dwelling, birds, cranes, geese, all the other fun stuff. No domestic fowl yet.
Not yet, no. I was wondering, because in terms of products, a lot of these species would be hunted or scavengers for meat, but in terms of, and leather, but in terms of of other, not quite industries, but like other uses, like, are you aware of any evidence, for instance, with whales, whether they were used to produce sort of oil for like lighting?
I haven't seen anything. Obviously, especially the Northern Isles, you see material evidence for oil production moving to the later prehistoric, especially like the Iron Age. But I mean, a lot of the stuff about whales I found was more of a kind of an inference, because we were finding some whale remains on Mesolithic sites. So they were most likely eating them, but I haven't really seen any evidence if they were actually working the bone or producing oil from the remains themselves. I mean, it's obviously possible, but nothing really concrete so far.
No, that's fair, because my feeling would be that, of course, that whale bone sort of would have been worked or put sort of in settlements. Of course, if you're just walking down the beach and you see sort of a whale carcass, the size of it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, you think like, oh, that's quite cool. I'm going to do something with it, put it in my settlement.
Yeah, I mean, most likely, I couldn't imagine that they were using whalebone for building, small settlement encampments, because obviously in the Northern Isles, that was a practice that was used, beyond the Iron Age, and for obvious reasons. Those bones are huge. So, you pop a rib bone over and you have yourself a nice little tent. Or at least the backbone of a tent. But yeah, I mean, again, we don't really see that kind of, I think, workmanship as much as until we get into our next period, which is the Neolithic to the early Bronze Age.
Because as we've discussed, one day in the Near East, a farmer left his house and found that an aurochs had turned into a cow.
I hate when you go to sleep as an auroch and you wake up as a cow. Oh, relatable feeling.
Like this if you cry every time.
Sunday, I'm an auroch. Monday, I'm a cow.
We're very but funny. Just jokes aside, of course, with the Neolithic, we see a shift from sort of hunting and gathering, which, again, doesn't just completely stop. That still happens.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But we see a shift to farming. And, of course, that traditionally sort of starts off in the Near East, because that seems to be where we got the earliest evidence of it at present. And then sort of this new farming trend, which I guess it was a fad that definitely stuck, because we still do it, is spread sort of westwards. And you start seeing it sort of coming all the way sort of to Western Europe. Again, like a very, very oversimplified way of putting it, but it gets the idea. Because people just start having sort of more permanent camps as opposed to like the seasonal camps that you'd see earlier in the early prehistoric period, and slowly, domesticating a variety of species and sort of people becoming more sedentary.
Yeah, and one thing that I'm always interested in, because obviously as archaeologists we're into ritual. One really interesting thing as you shift from Neolithic onwards is you start to see what we could call, deposits and ritual rites and things like that are starting to occur more in these domestic spheres rather than in very separate places. We're obviously seeing a kind of, emphasis on the domestic as people become more settled. So that kind of makes sense, I guess, in a way.
Because I think we have a lot of examples of that sort of in a variety of sites, and like all the ones I can think of, they're all in Turkey for the most part. And you see some very interesting cases of sort of like what we believe is there was sort of ritual animal deposition in sort of what would have been sort of the domestic sphere, like within dwellings and such.
Yeah. And then, species-wise, again, we're kind of seeing similar in terms of wild animals. We're seeing similar species. But, of course, the big thing here is our domestic hits. Your goats, your cattle, your sheep, your pigs, all those things. And, we also start seeing, as we start finding more worked bones and worked material, things like, red deer become really important during this period for, their antlers, which actually, interesting enough, they weren't necessarily hunted for their antlers. They were usually just collected as they shed their antlers. And, tool making became very important as we focus more on agriculture.
Yeah, because in a way, like, why would you go through, if you're just after the antler, why would you go through all the effort of going, like, to hunt yourself a deer when you can just slaughter your own cow, where you can just pick them up off the floor? Because, like I said, a good way now, like, for some reason, the actual terminology has escaped me at present, so maybe you can help me with it. In a way, how would you be able to tell whether the deer was hunted or whether the antler was shed? And usually is what you're looking for is at the very base of the antler.
Yep.
So of course you see sort of that disc with the ramifications shooting off it, which is where sort of the antler would attach to the head. But I forget what it's actually called.
I also forget what it's called.
Because it's not the crown. The crown is on the exact opposite side of it. It's right at the tip of it in red deer. But of course, if you see that sort of disc with sort of antler sort of ramifications attached to it, it looks a bit like a sun.
Yeah, it does.
It's how I picture it. Of course, if you see that, that means that the antler has been naturally shed, because that's just literally how it comes off of the deer.
Pops right off. Yep.
But of course, if that part is not present, then it would have been forcibly taken off the deer while it hopefully was already dead.
I mean, that's a good way to kind of also wrap up the idea of changing relationships, because the other thing that's really big is that in England, we're starting to see deliberate burials of dog remains, particularly in the early Bronze Age. So it's this shift, not only agriculturally, but also this kind of massive shift in the way we relate to animals. And I think what we will do at this point is take a break, and we will do our case studies to further talk about these relations and whatnot.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
Hello, and welcome back to Archaeoanimals, where we are talking about the zooarchaeology of the early prehistoric period as part of our new mini-series called Time Warped. We're looking at different periods, all the other stuff. You should know if you were listening. I don't know why anyone would start on the third part, but it's case study time. So let's just do it.
Well, maybe because, like the case studies are the favorite part of our show because we've decided that.
Yep. No one has actually said it, but I've decided it is the best part of the show.
I think I can picture people just downloading the episode and putting it straight to part 3. Just case studies.
Okay. Yeah.
Why not?
I'm sure. There's one person out there, probably. I bet you there's like archaeologists maybe who go to the third part to see if we actually cover their site. We are going to, I guess I will start this segment because the first case study we're talking about is my stuff. Ooh, I love talking about me. All other fun stuff. Well, yeah, exactly. The funny thing is actually, technically, I could probably talk about my site every single episode. Not just because I've dedicated, 4 years of my life to doing this as part of my PhD. Nah. But also, it just spans like a very long period of time.
But in a way, I really think you should, because it would be interesting, if anything, even doing an entire episode, so you can actually see zooarchaeology in different time periods, but all encompassed by the same site. So actually, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, for some people, maybe not me. What if I just read my thesis out loud? How long will it take to get through over 400 pages of work? A couple episodes, right? It's an audiobook now. But yeah, no, it is. That is one of the things I really like about this site is that it was originally pitched to me as, it's a later prehistoric site. And that one of the things I really like about this site, the Covesea Caves, which I guess I should name it, is that it takes place in a very long period of time. Its earliest period is early Neolithic, and it is not constantly, it's in use every so often up until the post-medieval. And obviously, we have more modern day stuff because all these archaeologists are running in or falling in, if you're me. So yeah, there is something there in terms of kind of looking at the differences in time But, we don't want to bore everyone with it so much. But we will talk about it for this episode, I guess. Which, hilariously, this is the smallest assemblage I have in this cave is the early prehistoric stuff.
But if you'd like to hear a whole episode of Covesea Caves, please do let us know. I'm sure Alex will be mega happy to oblige.
I better keep talking about this cave site that I dedicated 4 years of my life to. But yeah, I think I've talked about it before in other episodes because of course I would. But just a short recap. So the Covesea Caves are a series of cave sites on the coast of the Moray Firth in northeast Scotland. And it's basically a bunch of very interesting mortuary complex sites. They are human and animal bone assemblages. It's very strange. As I said, it spans a long period of time, the Neolithic to post-medieval, but what we will focus on in this part of the case studies is the first kind of context that we have, which is the Neolithic and Bronze Age context. So it's basically kind of focused on the animal butchery for utilization. So a lot of the evidence that I was going to say we found, I guess I found, that's weird, is we have evidence of skinning based on the amount of foot bones that we found. There was an inordinate amount of foot bones among these remains, which you wouldn't necessarily, I think of. The other thing I should point out is that these cave sites are so hard to get to the point that I had to go to Annie on the first day of excavation because I fell trying to get to these cave sites. So
it's just because you like that site so much, you want it to be just in situ.
Yeah, basically. I was just smashing my body off of a boulder, hoping that I could just get stuck there. But they are very difficult to get to. So when we have these kind of bigger mammals, we're not necessarily thinking they just wandered in. So we weren't expecting kind of these smaller bones. I think at the time when I started working on it, the interpretation that we were kind of playing with was, were these feasting going on? Because they were clearly disarticulating human bones already in these caves as part of their funerary traditions. Where they kind of doing the same with the animals and just bringing in parts they need. And so having these smaller bones was a bit of a surprise. And one of the interpretations I was kind of working with was, we were looking at something that was more based in utilization rather than funerary practices or ritual practices because of the skinning evidence we had. The meatier parts of bodies were missing in these cave sites. So it seemed like there weren't feasting or consumption occurring in these caves. They could have been taken out, obviously. It's a very difficult site. And one that maybe people shouldn't be doing their PhD on by themselves. But it was very interesting. And the kind of animals we found as well, again, these are the smallest contexts we had out of, in comparison to like the medieval or the Iron Age. But we still had a pretty decent, diverse group of animals represented. So bird-wise, you had great auk, which was a running theme in these caves. There's a lot of great auk. Cormorants, curlews, and then your gulls and things like that. Mammal-wise, we had sheep and goats. We had a type of pig, which I guess at this time, I think was likely pig, but I guess there could be boar in there. I think the bones that I looked at were most definitely pig and cattle. And then the two things that were really interesting were we had canids, which were potentially domesticated, but our ADNA work was kind of lacking. I didn't have any good results for that. So I have to just kind of say they're canids. We don't know if they're wolves or if they're domesticated dogs. But again, what we were talking about before, this is a weird period in that transition where dogs were becoming more domesticated. So, who knows? They could have been semi-feral, whatever. Nothing conclusive, unfortunately. But the one thing that I really wanted to talk about, and it's something we'll talk about in our next case study, is red deer. Red deer were like huge here. Not only like in terms of how many red deer there were, but they were actually massive. They were so big. We had a red deer mandible that was so big. I remember showing it to one of my supervisors, Julie Bond, who is a zooarchaeologist as well in Scotland. And she was like, that can't be a red deer. It's too big. And we ended up having to look at several deer mandibles, including looking at great elk. We had to look at caribou and reindeer. But no, it's just a massive red deer that were in these caves. And one of the really interesting things was we had this really gorgeous cranial vault. So like the top of the red deer skull that was just perfectly preserved like that. So of course people are like, oh, is this like Star Carr? Are there headdresses? And unfortunately, we didn't really have any evidence of, cut marks or anything in the same way that Star Carr does, which again, we'll talk about in a second. So you couldn't really say, but the fact that it was just like so perfectly preserved and left like that makes you kind of wonder, I guess. And there's also like a lack of non-cranial elements in these caves for red deer. So it was likely they were being disarticulated or processed elsewhere. And the cranial elements were brought wherever. Likely, antlers being taken out to maybe use tools, ornamentation. So yeah, red deer, big thing in the Neolithic here. And like I said, we will talk about it in our next case study.
Yeah, which again is a site that I'm sure we've covered numerous times before, but it does make for a pretty good sort of representation of one of the time periods which we've covered today. And of course, as you may have guessed by now, we're talking about Star Carr. It's a Mesolithic site in North Yorkshire that was likely to have been occupied seasonally for several hundred years. Because being Mesolithic period, it dates to around 9000 BCE. Because it's very give or take. Because it's famous pretty much worldwide because of its incredible preservation, which of course is all thanks to peat deposits. For those who are not very familiar with peat deposits, it's basically the same conditions thanks to which we've been able to recover the famous bog bodies.
Yeah.
That you sort of find, I guess, mostly in the later prehistoric period around sort of Northern Europe, sort of Britain, Scandinavia, and Ireland.
It's like an Iron Age type. I always associate with the Iron Age. I think there's probably more that are outside that period, but I think the bulk of them is more Iron Age.
I believe so, yeah. And of course, we know it was a settlement that was occupied, at least seasonally. Or it's inferred it might have been sort of the summer where it was occupied, because we have evidence of it being like a full-blown sort of settlement, because we have evidence of structures in the form of posts, which of course in the particular case of Star Carr, yes and no, because of course, being preserved in peat, you have the actual posts. You actually have wood. You also have a wooden platform at the edge of what used to be a lake.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure there's any sort of conclusive theories about what the deal with that was. Because again, as with a lot of earlier prehistory and later prehistory for that matter, it's just like, prehistory, why? Why though? Nobody knows. You do get that, especially with some of the mortuary practices, just but why though?
Oh, that's okay. Like my whole PhD thesis is, but why though?
And also just, prehistory is so metal.
It's funny because it rules, but if you're someone who actively researches it, especially when it gets a bit murky in terms of you don't have as much evidence, it can be very frustrating for sure.
Yeah, because I'm sure a lot of it is because they could.
I mean, that's literally it's basically what I used to write, my master's thesis, which was more later prehistory. But there's, I think, one of my interpretations of fishing remains was they probably just collected it because they look cool.
Which, to be fair, I think in most instances it was probably more sound than it being ritual or a fertility cult. So,
Yeah.
Usually humans being essentially the same across time, you know.
Ooh, shiny thing.
Something cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that looks cool. Shiny thing. I'm going to bring it back to my settlement.
Yeah.
Makes perfect sense. But in terms of zooarchaeological remains, there is, of course, evidence of hunting because we're still in the Mesolithic. The transition to farming hasn't quite happened yet.
Yeah.
So there's evidence of hunting deer, wild boar, aurochs, or would that be aurochsen, the plural?
Oh, I actually never thought of what the plural is.
Either or, big, scary, not quite cows.
Yep.
Them. And of course, they were using the remains of these animals also to create weapons, which almost it's not ironic, but it's like, as archaeologists have uncovered about 200 projectiles made out of deer bone and antler. So they were definitely making full use of the carcasses.
Yeah, and I think because I ended up using Carr a lot when I was doing my research, even though Carr is Mesolithic and the Covesea caves don't really start in terms of the archaeological record, doesn't really start until the early Neolithic. I feel like there must be a bit of crossover in, the importance of red deer per se. And there's actually, I only found it the other day, so not early enough to add it to our notes, but there's been a blog post going around of a zooarchaeologist kind of talking about, the importance of the red deer in the Mesolithic. And I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of, how much of that was probably carried over into the Neolithic. Still, even though we had all these massive shifts in practice because of the rise of agriculture. You know what I mean?
Well, and of course, if it's so the evidence is early Neolithic, you'd have still been in that transitional period.
Of course.
And again, going on the fact that it's an assumption that, everyone became a farmer overnight.
Yeah, they woke up.
It's highly unlikely that as soon as sort of the Neolithic period formally starts, you would have seen sort of farming across the board, especially, I guess, like from the little I know about Covesea caves, it tends to be sort of quite remote.
Yeah.
And Scotland is quite, that area you're saying how it's quite difficult to access. So I'm not sure, whether that would have been sort of prime farmland.
Yeah, no,
there's areas in the world that have never and still aren't suited to farming. So communities over there still probably do rely more on hunting and gathering just because of the climatic and the geology of the area is just not suited for farming in that particular landscape.
Yes, that arbitrary nature that we talked about, that again is going to be a very prevalent theme, I think, in this mini-series, in that, we, even though we do use these categories for ease of discussion and because, for the most part, a lot of these sites tend to fall in those kind of characteristics that they're very similar enough to kind of say this is that period. But, we're talking about how maybe necessarily you're not seeing the same emphasis on agriculture as other sites in the Neolithic. Again, which you just need to keep in your head. And that's why archaeology is simultaneously very interesting and very frustrating.
Yeah, because also it's just the fact that in some areas of the world, it's just like a farming system, the way we know it just doesn't quite work as well. It just you've got to work with your landscape, and of course, certain domesticates will be better suited to certain types of landscapes. Like for example, where I'm from, taking Britain for example, being a lot of sort of grassland and pastures, there is an inordinate amount of sheep being kept at the expense of goat. You don't tend to find goat as much. Where I'm from, almost the bulk of it is goat because it being quite mountainous.
Of course.
Herding goats makes a lot more sense than keeping sheep because the sheep will probably just fall off the cliff. Let's face it.
Anyway, we could talk about that for a whole episode, I feel like, but
were sheep falling off cliffs?
Yeah, it's funny. The thing that I kind of mentioned about Carr before that we have to talk about, because I would argue it's what it's most known for are the Carr headdresses.
I thought I'd leave it to you because you really like the headdresses.
I do love the headdresses because they are gorgeous. They're so well preserved to the point that you can see the cut marks that were made just to cut around the cranial vault to make sure that it was the right amount. The fact that they took care to actually cut the antlers, trim them down because it would be too top heavy. They even had these holes that they weren't necessarily drilled in. They were probably just perforated carefully. That was likely to help attach it to a human head because, obviously that's the main interpretation of these cranial vaults that they've found, or the frontlets, I think that what they refer to them as, because of the antler that's still attached to it, is that they were likely worn on the head. Of course, this kind of goes into two other interpretations where they worn on the head as part of, you guessed it, ritual, as a ritual costume, or were they hunting disguises to help hunt red deer, both of which, obviously, I don't think we'll necessarily ever really find conclusive evidence to that until we, maybe when we get time travel, we could see them do it. But, And
I mean, there's also like the very simplistic, I guess, interpretation of it just being a trophy that's hung up somewhere.
That is
and
true.
The holes
as well.
are there to hang it up. Because I guess a lot of the deer skull trophies that, you see in antique shops and such, it does tend to be just a cranial vault and the antler.
Yeah.
A lot of it.
I guess the only evidence against that is the fact that they're trimming the antlers down. But again, it could be just because it's easier to hang it up that way as well. There's also, it's interesting to note that although they're mostly stags because of the antler being present, there is, I think, at least one cranial vault that is from a female, which is actually the case in the Covesea Caves. The cranial vault that we had was a female as well. So they're so cool and very interesting. And again, it's an interesting to look at, not only because we're pre-Neolithic, we're pre-farming, and yet we still have these very close kind of relations with animals. And that will be the fun thing moving forward in seeing how these relations kind of change. But I think we're just about ready to wrap up.
Yeah, so the early prehistoric period is finished. It's over.
It's done.
It's been done.
We move on. We move on next episode.
Onto just as weird prehistory. Now, again, prehistoric people just doing prehistoric people things.
Yep, as you do. As always, we are on Twitter at Archaeoanimals. We obviously have a Facebook page as well, also at Archaeoanimals. You can like and subscribe and all the other fun stuff wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends about us. Always feel free to message us on Twitter or whatever if you have an idea for another episode. We love getting listener requests, things like that. Send us your fan art, because I have a small collection on Instagram of people's fan art, which is still wild. People do. And I think that's it.
Oh, and if you've got any complaints, direct them to Tristan.
Yes, please send them to our producer.
All the hate mail.
Just send it to him. Yeah. Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Archaeoanimals. Please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcast from. You can find us on Twitter at Archaeoanimals. Also, the views expressed on the podcast are those of ourselves, the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily represent those of our institution, employers, and the Archaeology Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.
When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Baker's, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Baker's worth it every time. Baker's, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.